heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to spend some time this hour talking about a biblical perspective on government, on law, on individual rights, education, and much, much more. Comes from this new book by Keisha Russell, who is certainly no stranger to this broadcast, Uncommon Courage, Defending Truth and Freedom While There's Still Time. 250 pages, 11 chapters, published by our good friends at Harvest House. We have information about it on the website in case you can't find it in your local bookstore. And we're going to work our way through all sorts of different chapters, which I think you're going to find very helpful. Toni Russell has worked as a federal law clerk on the Fifth Circuit Court. We talked about that recently. Of course, is a constitutional lawyer with First Liberty Institute, individual that has a degree or a couple of degrees in the area of education, but also attended Emory Law School and was the 2017 Emory University Graduating Woman of Excellence. And it is great to have you in studio once again.
Always a pleasure, Kerby.
This book I've been aware of for some time. You sort of had to put it on hold because you went and became a law clerk, which I think was a very prestigious appointment there as well. But now it is out, and I know Penn has talked with you about this, but I thought we would give it a full look at it today. But first of all, your first chapter really gives us the history, and people know you as a lawyer, but I've also introduced you a few times as an individual that was a teacher, and in some respects, both of those credentials are really relevant to what you're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, my background as a teacher, I think, really helped shape not just my career, but also my relationship with Christ. And so as a teacher, you know, I really learned to hear from the Lord and also advocate for people, my students, who were in my class because of behavioral disorders. And I don't even know if I've told you this, but I did teach students that were no longer allowed in the general education classroom because of their behavioral problems. Right. So a lot of those students, they were deficient in reading and things like that, but generally speaking, their IQs were okay. They were just misbehaving so much that they weren't learning.
Yes.
And so I got pretty much all those kids in one classroom. And so the battle became not just about teaching them academics, but also teaching them character and teaching them self-control and teaching them perseverance and teaching them that they could be, you know, whatever they wanted to be. And that took some time. You know, I spent a lot of time doing cultural building in the classroom, and then I was able to kind of move into the academics after that. And I learned very quickly that the students had been taught some pretty detrimental things, including what we call now critical race theory.
Yes.
And maybe then we didn't call it that, but it's the same thing, you know. And so I really had to deprogram them and teach them who they were without saying who they were in Christ, but teaching them that they were more than what they thought of themselves. And so that teaching really just kind of pushed me, I think, to be an advocate in a broader way. And so I decided that I was going to go to law school. I actually felt led to do that. And I was attracted to Emory because of their Center for the Study of Law and Religion. And so I ended up going to Emory eventually, and then working in the Center for Law and Religion, being mentored by a rabbi who taught me religious liberty in this incredible field that so few people even know exists. And that's where I was introduced to this amazing thing. And after that, I started interning for First Liberty Institute, and the rest is history.
Well, it's so good that we have you here and can call on you every once in a while. And it was a loss when you were a federal law clerk and could not join us around the table. But let's get into it. The first chapter is on Christianity and the Constitution. You see, I have my copy of John Eidsmoe there, and you and I have both read the same book. But let's get into that for just a bit, because frankly, a lot of the listeners, if they even took a civics class, and now sometimes we don't even teach that in some classes, certainly certainly didn't get the Christian foundation for that. And when we look at the fact that if you start with a biblical view of human nature and the need for us to control power, you end up with a government very much like the one that we have described in the Declaration of Independence and actually defended in the Federalist Papers.
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's really important that students start with that kind of foundation. I think we skip all of that, and we definitely skip sort of the Christian foundation that our country was based upon. And students need to understand this because they need to understand why we have the rights that we have, what the thought process was behind the creation of our Constitution. And this is also that they can see when it's being unraveled. It's not enough for them just to know the text of the Constitution. They need to understand why. And so that's the reason why I wrote that particular chapter, because I think, and we're not just talking about students either. I met so many Christians in talking to them about my cases that our clients at First Liberty Institute, and so many Christians don't understand how robust and strong the protection of the First Amendment really is. And I think it's because they don't understand these basic principles.
It is not by happenstance that the First Amendment is the First Amendment for a lot of reasons in terms of free speech and freedom of religion and the rest. But one other thing I want to put on the table, and then we'll get into tyranny, because that is a very significant section of your book. But before we do so, a lot of people are confused. Is this a democracy or is it a republic? And you really deal with that issue as well, don't you?
Yeah, we're not a pure democracy, as most of your listeners know that because you do such a great job of educating them. We are a republic, right? We elect representatives to vote for us for laws and things like that. And one of the reasons for that is that sometimes the majority is wrong. And that's a hard thing to say to people, but it's true, and if you look throughout history, you can see instances when the majority of people believe things that just weren't true or completely immoral. And so that protects us from having sort of a big state like California, Texas, from running the entire country. Our smaller states still have a voice, and having a Republican form of government allows that.
Yes. Well, and again, this idea of individual rights, because your second section in your book gets into slavery. And again, you could say, well, if we had a vote, more than 51% of the South said slavery should be legal, but we certainly rose up, and the abolition movement, eventually even the Civil War, ended that. And so there are some really concerning issues there. And you do talk about this idea of individual rights, and that brings us back to another key principle. If the government gives you their rights, then the government can take them away. But if instead God gives you the rights and government is simply recognizing that those rights are endowed by what? Our Creator, then that's a real different idea as well, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. And that's so important for people to get, that our individual rights are God ordained. And that's the reason why the government must protect them. And so, for example, when we look at something like freedom of religion or free speech, the founders felt like this is a right that God wanted us to have. God wants us to be free to choose whatever religion we want. God wants us to be free to speak freely and to not be afraid. And that is why the government has to protect those rights. It's not necessarily because the government is saying, oh, out of the goodness of our hearts, we're going to give you freedom of religion and freedom of speech. We are holding the government to a contract. And that's what the Constitution is, a contract between the government and the people of the United States.
Going to take a break, but again, we have information about this book, Uncommon Courage, Defending Truth and Freedom While There Is Still Time. Came out in January. You perhaps can find it in your local bookstore, published by Harvest House, but we have a link to it so that you can get it either in paperback or Kindle. Also, of course, have a link to Keisha and First Liberty. We're going to come back, though, and we're going to talk about tyranny and totalitarianism, and two very significant chapters in that book, which I think you need to know about, but we need to take a break. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A significant number of young people have a positive view of socialism. In my booklet on a biblical point of view on socialism, I suggest this because of what they hear on college campuses and what they hear from politicians like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. John Stossel now provides another reason for socialism's popularity: social media. He documents the dumb things socialists promise. For example, one TikTok social influencer has a video proclaiming socialism is working better than capitalism 93% of the time. That misleading statistic is drawn from a study by self-described Marxists in the Journal of Health Services from nearly 4 decades ago. Another social media influencer proclaims socialism worked in China because it lifted over 800 million people from poverty. Yes, the per capita income in China has increased, but much of that increase came after China gave up on socialism and created a hybrid capitalism-communism society. Hong Kong, which adopted true capitalism, increased personal income much more and much faster than mainland China. Another social media influencer tells his YouTube subscribers the central idea that unites all socialists is maximizing freedom, democratization of power. The reality in most socialist countries is less freedom and only one political party. Perhaps you have a friend or family member that is promoting socialism. Let me offer my booklet on socialism, either in digital form or printed form. We need to be prepared to answer these socialist claims and promises. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again as we are talking today with Keisha Russell about her new book, Uncommon Courage, Defending Truth and Freedom While There Is Still Time. And Keisha, one of the chapters, matter of fact, one of the more significant ones, chapter 2, and then you get into it again in chapter 3, is this road to tyranny. And whether you look at a sort of popular book like 1984 or a little bit more academic book, The Origin of Totalitarianism, as soon as we talk about the positive, there is a natural tendency, even in republics, even in democracies, and in other countries around the world, towards totalitarianism. And certainly one example that you give is how very easily it is to slip into that situation.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is the portion that Americans really need to pay close attention to, because our emotions are being manipulated to kind of prime us to be easily taken over by immoral thoughts and ideologies. So, for example, with all of those things that we taught, Origins of Totalitarianism, 1984, they all kind of outline very similar things. And the first is that you divide and isolate people, right? In 1984, people weren't allowed to talk. They weren't allowed to fall in love. They weren't allowed to have relationships, because when you are in a totalitarian society, your only devotion should be to the government, to be to the leader. And the same is true in, Nazi Germany. The same is true with Stalin. They, these kinds of leaders want to be the only ones. And then the next step, which we are at in America for sure, is searing the conscience. That means convincing people to agree with things that they know are immoral or wrong. And that will necessarily prime the population to begin to either socially exterminate or physically exterminate people who the government doesn't like. So whether that be Jewish people, whether that be Christians, whether that be, between the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda, all of these things are designed to make sure that people have a seared conscience that that no longer pricks them to stand up for people who are now being persecuted in several different ways, either socially or physically.
And then the last one is this idea of exterminate, which
Yes.
I think is really something, because you would, if you'd seen, for example, China before Mao took over, you would say this is an advanced culture.
Mm-hmm.
If you looked at Germany before Hitler took over, you couldn't even have put your head around the idea of the Holocaust. We, of course, used the Hutsus and the Tutsis for just a minute, and of course, in Rwanda. But there are various, very, if you will, advanced cultures where we've seen just enormous number of people, Stalin's Russia, Mao's China, Pol Pot. And in some respects, we have to be mindful of the fact that once those individuals are in power and have complete power, extermination sometimes is the next step.
Yeah, and it usually is the intent from the very beginning.
Yes.
We're just not told. People aren't told. So Hitler didn't necessarily tell Germany, okay, we're going to kill every Jewish person when I'm in a leader, but he knew that was his goal from pretty early on. And so he just let the population begin to seethe over things that he told them about the Jewish people, and so that they would tolerate it. And not only that, they would be so afraid that they wouldn't speak up. Now, when I talk about soft totalitarianism in America, what a lot of you can kind of think back to is the days of COVID. And when we were really being controlled by the government through social media companies to control what we said. And we couldn't speak about the vaccine. We couldn't say anything the government didn't want us to say. And that is sort of the beginning of the end for freedom. And that includes in America, too. I mean, now we know the Biden administration was working with Facebook and really forcing them to deplatform people who weren't saying the right message. And so this is one example, right? Like just one example that's happening in America right now. But there's more. You know, if you talk about, for a while, you couldn't say marriage was between a man and a woman. All of these things that are just like very, very foundational for our belief system and for living in America. But we were being so controlled, and that's what happens in totalitarian societies. For us, it was deplatforming, but in Europe now, you can go to jail for saying things that the government doesn't want you to say.
Well, and even in Europe now, they're talking about something that looks like a social credit score. Now, in your book, you talk about, of course, the social credit score in China. That is, you get points if you say things positive about the communist Chinese government, and you lose points. And you lose enough points, you can't get on public transportation. If that was totally implemented, you couldn't even buy certain kinds of food. You couldn't leave certain areas. And, of course, the other way to implement that, and we'll get into that maybe in future programs, with a CBDC, a central bank digital currency, and they're talking about having that in Europe. Well, if I can control your money and I can control your social credit score, pretty much I have created a digital prison. It's just an open air prison, but I can control everything you do. I can punish anything that I consider to be bad behavior, and I can reward any kind of good behavior. And that looks like a prison system. It's just that we don't have bars around the windows, but we certainly have the possibility of that. And that's why you say that that's a threat to religious freedom in America, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And because religion, and particularly Christianity, the church is supposed to be, say, the moral compass of our country. And we're supposed to speak out against things like slavery, like segregation, those things that the abolitionists talked about and civil rights activists talked about. We know Martin Luther King was, motivated by his Christian beliefs, right? And so these things are foundational and important. And unfortunately, we're in a postmodern society that doesn't appreciate those kinds of things and definitely doesn't want to hear them. And so we get punished for saying things that are biblical, and we get punished. And ultimately, it works. You start to see a chilling effect in the church. You start to see a chilling effect with people who go to work and don't want to speak up when something wrong is going on, or when even a topic comes up that they don't believe in. They don't want to say, oh, no, I don't believe in that. I think that's wrong. And this goes all the way to parents who didn't want to speak up when men were in the locker rooms with their children, girls. And we see that happening and happened for a long time before we're at this point now where so many people are now speaking out against it because they know. But for many, many years, these parents were persecuted. They lost their children if they didn't want to, give in to gender transition and things like that. This is some heavy persecution that's happening, and will lead ultimately to tyranny if we get the wrong people in government.
The first section, of course, is the foundation for freedom. The second one is on keeping your conscience, and we'll look at some aspects of that. Matter of fact, 2 chapters on honor the golden rule. But even in your chapter on fear God, you sort of answer the question, Keisha, that I think some of our older listeners have had, and even some younger ones. That is, how did we get here? And you take us through kind of how we were indulging in what you call new freedom. And first it was changing the laws on divorce, and then it was changing the laws on birth control, and then eventually it was the abortion decision. Well, once we went down there, then it was changing laws on sodomy and pornography, and then eventually it was redefining marriage. And in some respects, none of that was announced ahead of time. Every bit of that was incremental, but now once we turned our back on our conscience, we no longer applied biblical principles, we ended up where we are right now in this particular situation.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of some things that you see in the Bible, right? Where, even Satan is tempting Jesus. He doesn't tell Jesus that he's going to completely ruin his life if he accepts what Satan's offering, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's not where things start, it's where they end. And so when we start with a government that says, okay, well, you can get divorced just because you don't like this person anymore. Or you know what? You can decide whether or not you're going to have that living baby, even though it's up to you that this has happened. So these kinds of things, sort of this leniency in the government to redefine standards that at one point were pretty etched in stone, is kind of why we got to a place where now we're allowing these grown men to be in the locker room with little girls. And the reason is because we have changed the standard so that there isn't a standard anymore. And so you can't advocate for one. So if you say, well, the standard is men and women get married and that's it, and you eradicate that particular standard, well, then what do you have to lean on in order to say to people, you can no longer, you can't be with a child, or you can't be with this kind of person, or you can't be with that. These kinds of things unravel the entire institution. And in order to save it, we have to protect the foundational beliefs that are attached to them.
Yes, unraveling it. So whether it's a row of dominoes dropping or taking out some of those Jenga pieces, either way, whether it's Jenga or dominoes, you can see how we ended up there. When we come back, we're going to talk about honoring the golden rule, because we're going to, for a few minutes, talk about some dark chapters in American history, from slavery to abortion, and also talk about, well, is there a solution? Well, I think that's a kingdom agenda. And then talk about other issues that we need to address, all part of the book, Uncommon Courage, Defending Truth and Freedom While There Is Still Time. Keisha Russell with us, and we'll be back right after this.
Are you confused about changes happening in Washington, D.C.? Well, you're not alone. Are you frustrated that you can't get the full picture of what's happening from the mainstream media? You are not alone in that either. And that is why Americans need a voice they can trust, a voice that provides accurate news, trustworthy information, and most importantly, a voice that is anchored to God's Word. Point of View is that voice, but we need you. In just a few weeks, Point of View will celebrate Truth Team Week, where we encourage listeners like you to join the team of people keeping truth on the air. But you don't have to wait to make a difference. You can make a difference right now by visiting us online at pointofview.net and join the team. That's pointofview.net. Or you can call us toll-free to join at 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
In studio with us today, Keisha Russell, as we talk about her book, Uncommon Courage. We've talked about the foundation for freedom and now want to focus on keeping your conscience. A little bit later, we'll talk about some areas of influence and can God send you. Let me mention that, first of all, you should be able to find the book in your local bookstore, about 250 pages, 11 chapters, published by Harvest House. But we also have a way in which you can contact Keisha. ToniRussell.com. Don't even have to know how to spell all that because the link is right there. And that will give you some information that you can have, as well as, most importantly, not only will you learn about the book, but there's a button that you can click on for speaking, and that gives you an opportunity to contact her as well and learn a little bit more about some of the resources. So if you're looking for the book, you can find it in the local bookstore. Of course, we also have it linked on our website at pointofview.net. And again, you can get that in either paperback or Kindle. But Keisha, let me talk about Honor the Golden Rule, Part 1 and Part 2. Really some dark chapters of American history, from a civil war to civil rights. And we should also, as we talk about America's godly heritage, talk about some of the flaws. And one of those, of course, is slavery.
Yeah, definitely. So the idea of honoring the Golden Rule is really handling the idea of supremacy within us, this idea that we are above other people and we deserve better than someone. And that's what slavery was all about, right? So I think slavery and us talking about that and really acknowledging sort of the framers, and not that they overlooked slavery, but they didn't declare in the Constitution that slavery was unconstitutional, and they could have, right? And so while acknowledging that the foundational principles of the Constitution were good, moral, we can also at the same time acknowledge that people are applying these principles and dealing with these things, and people are flawed. And so they're going to make the wrong decisions sometimes. But ultimately, we were able to rise out of it. And I think the idea of supremacy and it really kind of leads into the idea of abortion, which people don't like, and they don't like the idea that a lot of conservatives say supremacy and this idea of racial cleansing and things like that was what ultimately led to abortion and why we have that right now. And I think it's really easy to see what's the ultimate way to honor someone else is to honor their right to life. It's to honor the fact that they are allowed to live. That's it. That's a very basic principle that I think very few people would disagree with. But then you see a lot of leftists now, one of their tactics is to say that the baby isn't alive, but none of them can tell you when it actually becomes alive, right? If it's not at conception. And that's why, because they're wrestling with this truth that they are, in fact, killing a human being, and they're trying to wiggle out of that. And I think the best thing we can do is hold their feet to the fire on that point and help them confront it. I had a conversation with a woman who, she was very upset about the what she felt where it was police brutality against blacks and things like that. And I asked her if she had ever had an abortion, and she said she had 3 and she wasn't ashamed. And I asked her, well, don't you think it's important for you to recognize that you've killed more black people than that cop that you are upset with right now? And obviously it didn't go well. But she did actually confront the point later, a couple weeks later. But it's important. We have to keep throwing this, to people in people's faces. Like, this is a life. And if we continue to say when that life is worth or living, then eventually we won't be able to stop that. We'll be able to say that about any group of people, which is why a lot of leftists are having trouble right now. I mean, the treatment of the Jewish community at Columbia and things like that. All of that is because they have no respect for the honoring the Golden Rule, frankly.
One of the things I like about this is you do make the connections, and I think they are there because you have, again, this idea of slavery, and then after, of course, the Civil War, and during the time in which Charles Darwin writes The Origin of Species, but it also talks about favored races. So you already have the beginnings there. Then you talk about Francis Galton, who was the founder of the British eugenics movement, who was a cousin of Darwin, and later on Darwin's son also headed that up. And then you take it to Margaret Sanger, you take it to Adolf Hitler, you take it to the issue of abortion, and then eventually even take it to the issue of legalized infanticide. And so there's a sense in which there is a direct connection, and it's a connection that not many people want to make, and you make it in the book, and I think you make it very persuasively, and it's a reminder that whether you're talking about abortion, whether you're talking about slavery, whether you're talking about Jim Crow, whether you're talking about segregation, whether you're talking about Planned Parenthood, it's all connected, isn't it?
Yeah, and you cannot separate these issues, even though the left tries really hard to do that. And even a lot of Christians I've spoken to try to, justify abortion, and with all of these, ridiculous arguments about what if that person is going to end up in an abortion or an adoption agency and they end up in a bad life. But it's not up to us to make those decisions about someone else's life. That's up to God. And if we're Christians and we truly believe in His will, then we will allow that person to be born and let God take care of the rest.
I might just mention there's a lot other things to cover there, but I want to certainly cover all of the books. So about this time, people are going, okay, I'm a little bit discouraged. So what do I need to do? And you are smart enough in Chapter 7 to talk about live with purpose, but especially this idea of kingdom agenda, because really we need to, even though we look around us and we see some things that need to be changed. Matter of fact, you have a chapter on criminal justice and one on education. We'll get to those probably soon enough. But at that point, you just felt the need to remind us that don't get bogged down with the details. We really need to follow a kingdom agenda, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, this is where Christians were part of God's kingdom, and He has an agenda, and He wants us to help Him fulfill it. And all those words in the Bible will help direct us, but also what we encounter in the culture is really designed to sharpen us as believers. And all these things that we're talking about, abortion, the things that may trouble us, it gives us an opportunity, gives the church an opportunity to educate their congregation and to ensure that every single person in that congregation knows the truth and can proclaim it.
Well, again, some of the other issues you address, and I'll just pick them off real quickly. One is on the issue of justice, established justice and American justice, but in particular, you had a whole section, if I remember, yes, on criminal justice flaws, and we've done some booklets and some articles on that. But as a lawyer, I don't think we've really ever taken the time to talk about some of the things that need to happen in our criminal justice system, and looking at that from your unique vantage point, I think you actually point out some things that we need to fix.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things that I say, which I think is probably the most controversial in my opinion, is that the 13th Amendment should be amended to reflect a proper view of slavery. And, the 13th Amendment says that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. Now, my view is that slavery is immoral completely, and it's not immoral until someone deserves it. And so I think that's something that we can look at and say, is it really okay to use prisoners for free labor? Now, we all have, I'm not sticking up for prisoners. I'm just saying that
yes, this
idea of slavery is improper, and we shouldn't be justifying it in any way in the 13th Amendment. And then we have this, a couple sections on prison labor and, how that works. And really, I think there are ways to work around the slavery issue in a sense that we don't have to, force labor upon anyone.
I think that makes some sense. And again, I'll hold up the booklet we did on criminal justice, but that was more in the criminal justice system. But this whole section you have here on the prison labor, racial disparities, mass incarceration, private prisons, and all the rest probably is something we might want to cover in the future. So I certainly think that would be another one of those chapters that you might want to dig into. And we're going to take a break. When we come back, though, I'd be remiss if I did not ask Keisha about education. And that gets us into everything from, of course, critical race theory, as well as what you talked about, the school to prison pipeline, which we mentioned years ago and haven't talked about since. So again, you dig into some things that I think we need to understand. And as a former teacher, I think we should recognize that right now there are individuals suggesting maybe we get rid of the Department of Education. But whether we do or not, I think as a teacher, you will admit, as most people have to, that when you look at the nation's report card, and you mentioned that recently in another letter that I saw that you write, we're just not doing a very good job. If we were actually producing the best and the brightest students, and if indeed those students were going to be successful in the future, we might even turn a blind eye to some of the crazy things being taught in the classroom. But instead, what we're doing is teaching things that certainly are not helpful, probably harmful, and we're not producing good students. So when we come back, I want to talk to a former teacher about what she wrote about in her book, which again is entitled Uncommon Courage, Defending Truth and Freedom While There Is Still Time. If you want to know more about Keisha, we have a link to her website, her personal website. Of course, you've seen many of the others. We have a link to First Liberty Institute in case you wanted to contact her there. And of course, we have information about this book. I really do recommend it to those of you that want to understand some of the things happening in our culture from a biblical point of view. Let's take a break. We'll come back right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, but again, Keisha Russell with us, Uncommon Courage, Defending Truth and Freedom While There Is Still Time. And one of your chapters is on Liberate education, and it gets into a couple of things. So, of course, we've already mentioned critical race theory, but also just the concern that if we're not providing a good education for young people, we sometimes end up with a school-to-prison pipeline. You also get into the fact that we've got the sexualization of children, which we've talked about with you. So there's just a lot of work that needs to happen in the public schools.
Yeah, I mean, I think the mark of any good school is that they teach you how to read at least, right? I mean, that's sort of a basic expectation, and that's not even happening at this point. We know one of the latest America's Report Card said that nearly 40%, I think 40% of fourth graders couldn't read at grade level, which is almost half people. So that's very disturbing.
Very.
And, you know, we do know that, you know, illiteracy is one of the first paths to going to prison, committing crimes and things like that. 3 out of 5 inmates in prison can't read at all. So we know there's a direct correlation there. And so we definitely need to start holding our schools to account on this issue, that not only should you be teaching students, number one, how to read, reading, writing, arithmetic, all of these things that are really important, indoctrinating them in these other ridiculous progressive ideas isn't helping either. Because that's how you get, you know, what we were talking earlier about people on TikTok who were talking about socialism as if it's the bee's knees, because they just don't know any better, right? And I think that's what's happening. We really need to start taking control of our schools. Private schools are great, but public schools aren't going anywhere, and 90% of students are in public schools. So Christians, start, you know, holding tight to those public schools in your neighborhood. We need to get control of that area.
One of the things that you do talk about is the need for us to have discernment, because these last 2 chapters are one about the concern about propaganda and not getting good information. One of the reasons why certainly you and many people at First Liberty appreciate Point of View, because we're trying to get information out that you might not get anywhere else. And then also the need to take a stand. But first of all, you talk about speak and recognize truth. We can't be silent, as you pointed out, but it is sometimes difficult, especially during the pandemic, and even now some of the counter comments back and forth, to know who to trust. And I think it's going to be really incumbent upon Christians in this 21st century to really hone their skills at discernment, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's really important. And the best way to do that, obviously, is to be in the Word regularly. But I think the other thing is understanding that you don't necessarily have to have a YouTube channel with millions of subscribers. You have an area of influence in your own life. And no matter what you do, whether it's you're home with your kids and you are carpooling, or you're having, you know, PTA meetings, or you're with parents, or you're in an office every day, you know, there is an area of influence, and God has called you to be a light no matter where you are. And I think everyone can do that. But knowing the truth first is important so that you can proclaim it. And I also think, you know, we all have people in our lives who are either on the fence about Christianity or don't really understand what conservatives, you know, think or mean. And you have an opportunity to educate people about that all the time, but you have to educate yourself first.
One other chapter, of course, is Take a Stand, and I know that you certainly have, and I've seen you at various venues. Matter of fact, one of those shows you actually testifying in front of the United States Senate about Amy Coney Barrett. I've seen some of the videos of you in churches speaking on this issue, so again, I hope some people will consider having you come and speak. But a lot of that is taking a stand, and so whether it's a public, visible stand like you have taken so many times, or whether it's just taking a stand and deciding to go across the street and talk to your neighbor about the gospel, I think there are some real needs for us today as the church to be the church, right?
Yeah, and so many, I think, Christians have been silenced because they are afraid of being ridiculed or, you know, made fun of or whatever it is. And in some ways getting in trouble at work. You know, First Liberty has clients who are in trouble for speaking the truth. But you can't let that stop you. Jesus has told us what's going to happen to the people who love him in our culture. And thankfully, we live in America, and we don't have to worry about necessarily this really hard physical punishment. But at the same time, I think we always need to be willing to stand up to the culture no matter what, because, you know, Jesus wants us to be a light for him. And ultimately, a lot of the things I say in my book, I think will help at least give everyone a foundation and the ability to speak truth with confidence. One of the things I talk about is apologetics, and I talk about it very, very briefly. But I think once you understand why the gospel is true, why you can trust the Bible, then it makes you even more confident about it, and it inspires you even more to talk more about Jesus and what he's done.
Again, the book is entitled Uncommon Courage. I was thinking there's 11 chapters, but adding the introductory chapter, there's 12. People looking for a way to teach a small group, usually you break it into quarters. That's 13 weeks. And I think this almost matches up perfectly. This book is written in such a way that anybody that maybe wanted to understand some of these big ideas like government and religious liberty, and maybe understand a little bit of our history, slavery and abortion and criminal justice, they could understand that. But the way this is put together, this could actually be a small group study where you could take a chapter a week, have everybody read it, then come back together and talk about that. Or if you would want to maybe have you come and speak and do a kickoff or something like that, that would be just another way in which churches could use this, because it's really, even though it's called Uncommon Courage, you could just as easily say, Keisha educating you about government and religious liberty and rights and social issues and how to think about it from a biblical point of view. So in some respects, I think this would be a small group study as well.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why I called it Uncommon Courage is because I was motivated and inspired by our clients who really have to exercise some incredible courage to stand up to the government because of their faith, but also the righteous are as bold as a lion. I feel like God has called us to be brave and courageous, and I think that's what it takes to be someone who speaks truth in this culture right now.
Well, I would just say that, again, this is a book that you would really want to have, and it's very readable and easy to understand. And it's, in one case, is certainly educating you about these issues. But on the other hand, it's a warning because, as you point out, the seeds of tyranny have taken root, and you are seeing that many times you are having to defend clients and churches and others you never would have thought you would have to have defended even a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean, we're representing a woman named Marisol Castro right now, a teacher, 32-year veteran teacher in Connecticut, who keeps a small crucifix by her desk, her personal workspace, and is currently on paid administrative leave because they want her to take that crucifix down or put it under her desk, and I mean literally under her desk at her knees or in a drawer. So they want her to hide this crucifix because they don't think the children should see it, or they don't think anyone should see it. Now, what is that nonsense? This is America. That is not what the First Amendment says. And yet we're having to sue a school district over a crucifix. I mean, these things are just, it's so out of hand at this point. And the book is meant to address some of that.
Well, that's why we need Uncommon Courage, and that's why I would suggest you need the book, Uncommon Courage. I'm so delighted that Harvest House has published it. It is out. It is easy to find, but if you would like to know more about the book, we have a link on our website at pointofview.net. Click on the picture of Keisha, then go to See More, and we actually take you to her personal website, so you might want to actually contact her, maybe find out more about her speaking. You might want to get a copy of the book through her particular organization, however that might be. And of course, you can also go to First Liberty and find about that as well. Keisha, it's always great to have you in studio. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you for giving us an hour today.
Really appreciate you having me on. Always a pleasure.
Going to take a break, but let me just mention that, again, the book is entitled Uncommon Courage, Defending Truth and Freedom While There Is Still Time. It is something that I think people will really appreciate, and it will educate you, but it also is warning you that the seeds of tyranny have taken root. We got to stand strong. We got to speak out. And that's why we talk about it right here on Point of View.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I really appreciate your program. I don't get to listen to it every day because I have to work, but it's really a blessing to me and to all of us.
Everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
I just appreciate all you guys do. I mean, I learned so much, and it's amazing what you teach that I say to other people, and they look at me like, where did you hear that? So I appreciate you guys. So thank you for all you do.
I just turned your program on, and I want to just let you know how much I appreciate just getting the truth out.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to get into some of the things happening in the news, but I really appreciated the conversation last hour with Keisha Russell, Uncommon Courage. I told her that oftentimes in the past, we have sometimes selected books that we make available during our Truth Team, send them to some of our major donors. We're not doing that this time, but if we did, this would be one of those books, as well as maybe the book by Sean McDowell and even the one by Natasha Crane. We've had a couple of really good interviews lately, and even if we aren't going to send you those books, which we sometimes do to some of our major donors, I would encourage you to buy those books, and we make it pretty easy for you to do so because we post a lot of that on our website at pointofview.net. Okay, program note. I'm going to be talking about a lot of negative things for the next couple of minutes, and sometimes after I do that, in sometimes an open meeting, I say I'm just a regular bluebird of happiness, but I got to tell you the good and the bad. Let's start with the economy, which was not good yesterday. I almost brought it up yesterday. I thought, let me get the facts and the numbers, but this was a brutal day yesterday for the stock market. Now, if you are convinced that some of this as a result of decades of misspending by the federal government and then maybe a reaction to DOGE, then you'd say that's probably going to be a blame I'm going to put on previous presidents. If you're convinced that this is all due to the tariffs, and I think that's partially true as well, then you're going to put that blame on Donald Trump. So everybody sees what they want to see in some of the facts. But here are the facts. The Dow Jones average closed 890 points down. That was a really bad day. What? The first thing that probably goes to your mind is, well, I don't own any stocks, so why should I care? That would be incorrect. Turns out, and again, I'll pull some of this from Jim Garrity, who does a good job at digging up some of the statistics. Most recent numbers we have, 62% of Americans own stocks. I remember a time when I first started being a guest host with Marlon Maddox. We had a huge drop in the stock market. And at the time, some people said, well, who cares? Because that just affects people that own stocks. And back then, not a lot of people did own stocks, but now a lot of people do. 62% do. If you want to look at it a different way, as those of you that are still working and have some kind of workplace retirement plan, an IRA, a 401k, 53% of you have that in the private sector, and also about 49% have a private sector retirement savings plan. So again, whatever it is, a 401k, a 501, just a IRA, whatever it might be. Then just think about this. You might say, well, I'm a government worker. Okay, I work for the state or the local government. You are, again, in a situation where 81% of you in the various local governments participate in a workplace retirement plan. Another 18% participate in a retirement savings plan. So again, 401k, 403b, 503b, a thrift savings account, IRA, KEO, whatever, so quite a bit. And one last one, I know some of you are saving money for your kids' future college. That's about 17 million American families, and they're using 529s. which are invested in stock as well. And then some of you say, well, I'm a retiree. Well, again, according to the Federal Reserve, and you know that must be true, 48% of American retirees depend on interest, dividends, or rental income. That's not broken out, so maybe a little less than a majority, but still a significant number. So when the stock market goes down, it affects a lot of Americans. It probably even affected you. So again, that's something to mention, and that is something we will certainly pay attention to because that was a precipitous drop in the stock market. We'll see where that takes us. While we're talking about that, there's also some real concerns about the fact that it is becoming a little more difficult to be Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, or Elon Musk. Donald Trump, well, you already knew that. But again, you're hearing all sorts of people saying we're at war. Democrats saying after the inauguration of Donald Trump, we're going to fight in the streets and all the rest. But then what about J.D. Vance? Perhaps you have seen, and I've watched the video of where J.D. Vance, the vice president, was walking with his 3-year-old daughter. And he was harassed by a number of individuals. And there have been, I think he handled himself well, but again, can it even be possible now for an individual to just go for a walk with his 3-year-old? Apparently, that's a bit much, and he handled it as best as he could, but maybe next time some people aren't going to be willing to stop and just talk to him, but throw things at him or do whatever. Of course, when you have the Secret Service around, probably going to be a little bit more difficult. What about Elon Musk? Well, he said he's had more death threats than he's ever even imagined. But have you noticed the Tesla dealerships that are being firebombed or been shot at or vandalized? We've seen Tesla charging stations that have been destroyed. At a time when you thought, didn't the left like electric cars? Yeah, but not by this guy, apparently. I've seen videos of people driving a Tesla and being accosted by that, or people having a Tesla parked and having people knock the windows out. And certainly that is the case. And then if we go back to, of course, what it's like to be in the White House or the Southern White House, twice this week, Air Force fighter jets intercepted unidentified airplanes that were illegally approaching Mar-a-Lago. And then, of course, you had the Secret Service the other day shot a deranged man who was armed with a gun and a knife trying to get to the White House. So it is a little bit scary for individuals right now. Elon Musk, of course, has also said that his social media platform has been under a massive cyber attack. And Gary Bauer points out in his piece that it's hard to believe, but President Trump has not been given all the information from the FBI and the Secret Service about last year's assassination attempts. And one of those involves an individual that was attempting to shoot Donald Trump from his Florida golf course. This guy had 17 cell phones, but he's practically broke. Where did he get that money? So there are certainly some very concerning things that are unfolding. And anybody that has always wanted to say that we have problems with domestic violence, but it's always from the right, first of all, hasn't been paying attention to Antifa and a lot of leftist groups. But all you need to do is look at the newspapers right now, look at any of the internet websites, or look at some of these YouTube videos to recognize pretty dangerous. When we come back, though, I want to spend just a minute talking about another very sad story, and it is disturbing and concerning, and this comes out of Syria, so we'll talk about that as well. Then we'll get into some of the topics that I've posted on the website for you to read, and if you're reading ahead, we'll get to this first one by Rich Lowry, The Limits of Apocalyptic Incrementalism. What is DOGE doing? What can DOGE do? What should it not be allowed to do? We'll see if we can sort some of that out in just a minute. But let's take a break. And if you find yourself wanting some of the material we're going to be talking about today, as always, it's available on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A significant number of young people have a positive view of socialism. In my booklet on a biblical point of view on socialism, I suggest this because of what they hear on college campuses and what they hear from politicians like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. John Stossel now provides another reason for socialism's popularity: social media. He documents the dumb things socialists promise. For example, one TikTok social influencer has a video proclaiming socialism is working better than capitalism 93% of the time. That misleading statistic is drawn from a study by self-described Marxists in the Journal of Health Services from nearly 4 decades ago. Another social media influencer proclaims socialism worked in China because it lifted over 800 million people from poverty. Yes, the per capita income in China has increased, but much of that increase came after China gave up on socialism and created a hybrid capitalism-communism society. Hong Kong, which adopted true capitalism, increased personal income much more and much faster than mainland China. Another social media influencer tells his YouTube subscribers the central idea that unites all socialists is maximizing freedom, democratization of power. The reality in most socialist countries is less freedom and only one political party. Perhaps you have a friend or family member that is promoting socialism. Let me offer my booklet on socialism, either in digital form or printed form. We need to be prepared to answer these socialist claims and promises. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Let's talk about Syria for just a few minutes, and it has been 3 years since the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad fled to Moscow, but his departure did not end the civil war. More than 1,000 people, mostly civilians, have been killed in the past few days as armed forces of the current Islamic regime battle the loyalists to Assad. The numbers are higher if you go to Open Doors. You know that we oftentimes have Open Doors on this program. They're saying about 1,300. And the shocking news is that these various Islamist and Muslim forces were going door to door, just wiping out entire families in what you might call summary executions. And so some great concern here as well. I know that Tulsi Gabbard probably is not inclined to say I told you so, but she did tell you so. She is, of course, the director of national intelligence, in which she warned that this kind of thing could happen. And again, let me just read one of these news reports here. Violence has returned in Syria, bringing more new questions about the stability of a post-Assad regime and alarming vulnerability to different religious groups, most notably Christians. And we're talking about Druze, Alawites, and a number of others. But anyway, they point here more than 1,000. I think the number is now up to 1,300 1,500. Many were civilians executed and killed in cold blood in recent days, according to a report that came out yesterday from the United Kingdom-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. They go on to say clashes between forces loyal to new Syrian interim President Ahmad al-Sharia and deposed dictator Bashar al-Assad have led to the deaths of security force members and militants, but also hundreds, literally now more than 1,000, civilians, according to NBC reports. And matter of fact, even when I brought this up last hour off air, Keisha was saying, yeah, well, if you're going to talk about Syria, but nobody else is. Well, I'll give NBC, CBS credit, Fox News, but a lot of the people covering it are actually conservative or Christian outlets as well. Anyway, the NBC goes on to say that violence has occurred mostly in the coastal areas of Syria, which is the home of the Alawite community, which is a small Shia Islamic sect to which the Assad family belongs. After about 50 years of rule, as Assad ended with his overthrow last December, Syria is currently governed by al-Sharia, as I talked about before, a Sunni. And again, I've said before, sometimes the greatest threat to a Muslim is another Muslim, because if you're Shia and they are Sunni in power, they will kill you like they kill the Christians. One individual I thought I'd at least quote from real quickly is Eric Prince. He's the founder of this security firm called Blackwater. And he said the individual, the Sunni, has not been reformed. He might be a better tailor and even a better PR guy, but he's still very much an ISIS guy. And there is where we are once again. You know, just recently I was speaking about ISIS, and even as I was speaking about it, I was thinking most of the individuals hearing me speak about Islam and ISIS probably thought, well, isn't that old news? Well, no, it's as recent as this weekend. And it's a reminder once again to pray for persecuted Christians around the world. We will probably get some updates from our friends at Voice of the Martyrs and Open Doors, but I meant to cover some of that earlier, but did want to at least bring it up today. Just sad news, and the numbers go up every time I get a news report. Let's bring some attention back home, because a lot of people have wondered, okay, what about DOGE? If you listened to my program yesterday, we spent some time talking about how Donald Trump kind of pulled the reins up on Elon Musk quite a bit. And at the same time, Rich Lowry points out that, as we have said before, in budgetary terms, he says DOGE is small bore stuff. Although a relatively minor scale has been masked by its lightning pace, the screaming headlines, and the feeling of a fight between good and evil, it's been what he calls apocalyptic incrementalism. And the point he's making is something I've made before. DOGE, or the Department of Government Efficiency, is not going to balance the budget. DOGE is doing some good work in that it is pointing to some things which have been known for some time, have been great abuses of the federal budget. But again, these are pretty, what he calls small drivers of spending. And some of the others, to be honest and to be fair, Elon Musk and the individuals working with him cannot touch those either because of legal matters or political matters. For example, political, Donald Trump doesn't want to cut entitlements. Well, that's where most of the spending is. Probably not going to cut defense very much. And there are certain contracts anyway in defense and even in the Department of Health and Human Services and other places that you simply could not change at the moment. But what I think Rich Lowry says is that DOGE is sort of a typical or traditional Republican budgetary policy on steroids. And he says it's created the impression of a scandal after scandal revealed in real time with instantaneous results that these are leading to large-scale changes, and they're not. You know, there's a point in back and forth. We talked about the fact that when you had the Grace Commission back in the 1980s, they waited to the very end and released their report, which then was greeted by a collective yawn and tapping of the mouth. It's okay. That's all we already knew anyway, and nothing happened. So this time Elon Musk said, I'm going to, when we find a scandal, we're going to release it immediately, which in some respects has caused the Democrats to lose their minds, almost hair on fire kind of reaction. And on the other hand, people that are looking to cut the government, thinking that we've done more than we really have. And so whether, as he calls it, a freak out on the left or maybe a confidence on the right, we just need to face what it is. And again, he gives us some positives. He says it's no doubt that DOGE, or the Department of Government Efficiency, has identified true outrages and done good work, but the rush driven by urgency has led to maybe some exaggerations and mistakes. And as we pointed out yesterday, DOGE and Elon Musk have had to walk back one or two of their mistakes and reverse field on a few of their initiatives. But if nothing else, certainly Elon Musk has changed the narrative around Washington spending and maybe going to open up the idea of getting some intelligent cooperation from Congress to produce some really significant reforms and cuts. So good news, bad news on that. But just before we take a break, I also want to point you to another article, and this one written by Senator Rand Paul, in which he says, congratulations to Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency for stopping the insane left-wing advocacy spread through foreign aid. He talks about some of these boondoggles, which he used to highlight through his Festivus report. But he says, fortunately, we can see some of the stops, but the best thing is for the Congress to codify these actions. And he says, fortunately, the law allows the president to send funds that he determined are wasted or unnecessary back to Congress via special legislative vehicle called rescission. I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, but you might want to read this because rescission bills are privileged. They must receive a vote and only needs a simple majority to prevail. He said the last time the president attempted to use rescission was back in 2018 during his first term, where he proposed about $15 billion in cuts. In that case, Senate blocked it. This time you have a Republican Senate and a House. So he points out that there are, in his own reports over these years, billions of dollars of waste, and that these have actually hit a record high because of the previous administration. And so he says rescissions aren't about gutting essential services, but about stopping unnecessary spending. Every year, federal agencies rush to exhaust funds before the fiscal year ends to justify their bigger budgets. We've talked about this before. The throwing the gold bricks over the Titanic, as we called it. And he says rescissions would help break the cycle by returning unspent funds instead of letting bureaucrats funnel them into pet projects. If a program runs under cost, the savings should go back to the Treasury, not be repurposed for waste. So there is a piece that you can read on the pros and cons of DOGE and one on what can Congress do to make some of these necessary cuts permanent. And so, again, I think you're going to find some of that very helpful. And be watching because very soon we're going to be posting a new Take Action item. And I think you'll certainly want to let your members of Congress know about that as well. By the way, if we don't hear pretty soon from Congress, we're going to have to say it's maybe time to contact Congress because we're going to run out of money at the end of the week. Yes, once again, we could have a showdown and a shutdown. Let's hope not, but we'll pay attention to what's happening each day, and we'll talk about that maybe right after these important messages.
If you appreciate the trustworthy news and biblical worldview that you hear on Point of View, would you consider joining our team, the Truth Team? Listeners like you have been the backbone of Point of View for 53 years. But today there are more voices competing for Americans' attention than ever before, and few of them are anchored to biblical truth. By joining Point of View's Truth Team, you can be an integral part of keeping truth on the air. In just a few weeks, Point of View will celebrate Truth Team Week. But you don't have to wait till then. You can join the Truth Team right now and help us get a head start on our $150,000 spring fundraising goal. If you appreciate Point of View, please join the Truth Team. Join today. by visiting us online at pointofview.net. Or you can call toll-free 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we're going to get into some other issues, but I did mention this in passing, and it's worth bringing up again that a little bit later today, now I know some of you listen to this program on tape delay, but certainly as this program is ending, which would be 4 p.m. Eastern Time, 3 p.m. Central, or you can kind of figure out wherever you are in the country, the House will vote on this particular bill, and this bill is what is called a clean CR. What does that mean? This would be a continuing resolution. In the past, sometimes we've had some continuing resolutions that have been loaded up with all sorts of pork barrel spending, and this one would be just a clean one because there is a desire on the part of the House of Representatives to pass it so that we don't have to shut down the government after Friday. That makes some sense. And there has always been a desire on the part of an opposing party to use that to get some things they want. And so, obviously, when Democrats were in control of the House of Representatives under Nancy Pelosi or whoever it might have been, the Republicans said, well, we want to get some cuts in the CR, the continuing resolution. And the argument then was, well, are you going to shut down the government, knowing full well that most of the mainstream press, New York Times, Washington Post, and others, would blame the Republicans for the shutdown. Well, now the shoe is on the other foot. The role is reversed. Now the Republicans are in control of the House, and Democrats, because they don't like DOGE or don't like Trump or whatever, want to shut down the government. But do they really risk doing that? Because this is a completely what you call clean continuing resolution. This just provides the funds to actually go from March to the end of September, which is the fiscal year. Now, there are some Democrats that, well, most Democrats would vote against that just because they're supposed to. You have at least one Republican that for sure will vote against it, and that is Representative Thomas Massey, the Republican from Kentucky. But you have a handful of others that are undecided. And the desire right now for the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, is to pass this continuing resolution and then send it to the Senate. Now, your problem with the Senate is you need 60 votes to end cloture, to actually enact cloture, or to end the filibuster, however you want to say it. And so you have 53 Republicans. Do you have 7 Democrats that would rather not shut down the government? I know some would love to do so, but are there a few that might at least say that makes no sense? We need to keep funding the government. We'll fight our battle for another day. But if you can get 53 Republicans to all vote for it, I think you have those, and at least 7 Democrats, then you have the funding for the federal government. If not, this time next week, we're going to talk about a federal government that's been shut down. So anyway, that's the story there. And if the vote does not go well in the next couple of hours, I can predict what might end up being our action alert for the rest of the week, but we'll see how it goes. And more to the point, tomorrow we have Bruce Shaw in studio, and he's kind of an expert on economic issues. We're going to talk about democratic capitalism with him, and I'm sure he'll have some things to say whether it passes or doesn't pass. So we'll cover some of that tomorrow. But in the meantime, let's just hope and pray that we just keep the government going. Last thing we need right now is a government shutdown. Everybody agree? We got enough problems. We do not need a government being shut down simply because some Democrats can't decide to keep the funding going at least to September 30th. So you got what you got. Couple of other pieces. Speaking of Democrats, this piece by Colonel Allen West. I was even telling Keisha that every once in a while I see an Allen West column, and I just have to post it for you because it's so good. And it has this very fundamental question. What do Democrats stand for? Now, he's using it in both senses. What do you stand for in terms of ideology, but also what would you stand for at the State of the Union address? And since it's a week after the State of the Union address, I thought it would be good to one more time remind us what Democrats in unison did not stand for at the State of the Union address. I'll just read a few. He says, why not stand when it was announced that military recruiting hit a 15-year high? Another one, why not stand to congratulate a young man who found out from the President of the United States that he was accepted to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point? Why not pay homage and stand for a woman who has lost her 12-year-old daughter to two criminal illegal immigrants who now has a nature preserve named for her honor? He goes on to say, why not stand and support a young woman, a volleyball player, who had her head smashed and suffered traumatic brain injury from a biological male who spiked a ball to her head? And one more, he says, why not stand for a 13-year-old brain cancer survivor who was ceremoniously given an honorary membership into the U.S. Secret Service, who then gave the head of that said agency a huge hug? And so again, he's asking, why wouldn't you stand for some of those? You may not like Donald Trump. You may think that he is a fascist. You may think that this country is headed down the road towards tyranny, none of which I believe, and I think most of them don't really believe. But they all had to sit. Now, the one time they did decide to stand was a few days later when there was the censuring of Representative Al Green, the Democrat from Texas. And in order to actually disrupt again the censure ceremony, you had those willing to stand in the well of the House of Representatives. This time they did decide to stand and sing "We Shall Overcome." Colonel Alan West says, overcome what? And he says, I remember the time when Democrats did stand and cheer in unison. That's when Barack Hussein Obama asserted during a State of the Union address that he had a pen and a phone and would take executive action. They were all fine with that, he says. A couple more in his piece. Does the Democratic Party stand for open borders and for allowing criminal illegal immigrants like the ones who murdered 12-year-old Jocelyn Nungare to remain in our country? Democrats had some cute little paddles, he said, with messages. One of them said, Musk steals. And yet here, the Democrats could not stand for the revelation of fraud, waste, and abuse of taxpayer dollars. Do the Democrats not stand for a strong military with increased recruiting? Do they really stand with a biological male that smashed a volleyball into a young girl's head? Do they really stand against Title IX and protecting women's sports? Even when it was announced, he says, that an ISIS terrorist responsible for the Abbey Gate bombing, which took place in Afghanistan, that took the lives of 13 American troops, Marines, sailors, and a soldier, the Democrats could not stand. And so again, the question he has is this: are there any Democrats who will stand for the right reason with the American people? There must be 5 who would look at what happened a week ago at the joint session of Congress and say, I cannot stand for this anymore. Come on, there are some who rejected despicable behavior and wish not to stand for progressive socialists and their ideological agenda. The judgment of the American people is coming. The electoral power will never be bestowed upon those who would not stand last Tuesday evening. So, piece by Alan West. Just, again, a reminder that that happened a week ago. Americans' memory is pretty short. Maybe by the next election, it will all be forgotten and perhaps even forgiven, but it's something to remind us of, at the very least, 1 week after that special message before the joint session of Congress. Just before I take a break, let me just mention real quickly that Keisha Russell talked about what was happening at Columbia, and I might just mention that over the weekend, ICE agents arrested Mahmoud Khalili, leader of the pro-Hamas demonstrations at Columbia University. And interestingly enough, Columbia's reaction was not to try to say, good, we want to protect Jewish students. Instead, Columbia posted a protocol with phone numbers to call if students are approached by law enforcement when they are engaged in anti-Jewish protest on campus. They also gave suggestions on how staff members could delay ICE agents. So did the Trump administration sit back and say, well, I guess there's nothing we can do? No, the Trump administration just announced that it's revoking $400 million in grants to Columbia University. They asked for it, and we'll see where that goes in the next few weeks. Come back, just one last piece, some of the comments being made about J.D. Vance and some of the reactions to that as well as we wind down. Don't forget, tomorrow we will be spending some time talking about the economy with Bruce Shaw. Also, our good friend Paul Barreca will be dropping by, and we'll get an update on some things happening overseas and maybe even an update on our trip to Greece. All that coming up right after these important messages.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that my commentary today is on socialism. Let me also mention that we do have a booklet on socialism, which, interestingly enough, was really tied to some of the great material put out a number of years ago by Dinesh D'Souza in his book, The United States of Socialism, and really gives kind of an answer to some of the arguments being made at the time by Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. That book is still available, and of course you can request it. But my commentary today also maybe suggests that it's time to do an additional booklet, because this one is all about some of the material that John Stossel dug up in his latest video, Dumb Things Socialists Promise. We've always wondered, why is it so many young people believe socialism is better than capitalism? Even in my book on socialism, I have a whole section here on, does the Bible teach socialism? Because some people think, well, that's more biblical, it's more Christianly, it's more compassionate, and all the rest. Well, that's one issue, and I certainly take that on in the booklet, as well as one on capitalism and socialism, which we'll talk about tomorrow with our conversation. But the piece that is done by John Stossel talks about a lot of the social media influencers that are spreading a lot of misinformation, almost intentionally erroneous information about socialism. And in the commentary that I have there, I mentioned 3 different statements by social influencers that then are quickly answered. And so as a result, you may have a friend or a family member, maybe a young person's gone off to college and convinced that socialism is a good thing. First of all, we are making available my booklet on socialism. You can get it either in digital form or printed form. Just let us know that you would like it, and we can either mail it out to you or we can send it out by email, and you can take that one. But also this commentary is just a quick answer to some of the kinds of things being spread on social media. So again, it's a resource we want to hand to you, and it is a service that we provide here at Point of View. Last piece, humor and the cultural divide is what I called it. Selena Zito called it the left's reaction to Vance memes underscores the cultural divide. First of all, everybody seems to right now enjoy putting together memes or various fake images of the vice president, and his face sort of lends itself to that. Of course, look at all the pictures they've used of Donald Trump over the years. But Selena Zito put it this way. She said, on Sunday, a reporter for Atlantic wrote a 1,200-word think piece on memes of Vice President J.D. Vance. And if you haven't seen him, and we on the article can see it, there's one where they photoshopped his face onto the face of Abraham Lincoln, because after all, Lincoln and J.D. Vance have a beard. And it's amazing. It really is well done. Then they have one where it shows him in the body of Leonardo DiCaprio, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and others. And so you can see those pictures if you go to our website right now. And they're pretty funny if you think about that. But the argument from the writer is this. The best jokes always have a kernel of truth in them, and these memes, he's saying, about J.D. Vance work against him because there's no silver lining to look like a doofus. In other words, the argument he's making is that all these memes are making him look like an idiot. And maybe that's the goal of the liberals, to try to make J.D. Vance look like he's not well educated. They got away with that with a previous vice president, but that was under George Herbert Walker Bush. And I just don't think this is going to work with a guy that has been a lawyer, a successful person in Silicon Valley, very articulate in the rest. But Zito, that is Selena Zito said, I've been writing about a culture divide that exists in our country between regular people and cultural curators. And she says, basically, people in power see the world differently than those who do not have power. And she says the divide has never been more glaring than in the conclusion of the piece by Atlantic. And she says, look, the reporter's not a bad person. That's just how he sees the world and how he views consequences in American politics through it. So then she begins to talk about some of the comments of these memes. One comes from a lawyer in central Pennsylvania who actually wondered if anyone in the media has any sense of humor at all, saying, if anything, this is the lawyer, Scott Paterno says, Vance, if nothing else, is comfortable in his own skin and confident in his own ability. In another one, he said the retweet by, again, J.D. Vance was, he said, brilliant. Then she quotes from Wendell Lee, an individual in Missouri, who said that Vance isn't being ridiculed, but he's being treated no differently than any of us treat one another when we're joking about it in real life. And so Wendell Lee says he's one of us. if anything, the way in which, and I started by talking about some of the people that were berating J.D. Vance when he was walking his 3-year-old, and if you see him, he's got a sweater on, he's got a hat on, just looks like one of the people, and these memes kind of create that as well. And interestingly enough, Selena Zito, I gather because of that last name, is probably Italian, talks about some of the stories that we've all told. She says, for example, living in a tight-knit community where the temperatures got really cold. One time a guy slipped on a red sweatshirt when the air got cold, and he was called Mr. Rogers all night. We've all done this. We see somebody dressed up and they got a red sweatshirt on. Oh, are you Mr. Rogers or something like that? Said another guy looks so much like the former Pittsburgh Steelers quarterback that he was called the quarterback's name more often than his own. We all throw insults at one another, and none of us in the neighborhood ever thought it was abnormal. And she says, as someone who came from a family of many uncles, brothers, sons, nephews, and son-in-laws, I can personally attest that if they did not give you a rather undesirable nickname or find a way to give you the business, they wouldn't think much of you. And let me just end with this. Haven't we all been in a situation where we give somebody some screwy nickname, and then we do it because we like the guy? I have not ever said on the air all the nicknames I've collected over the years, but starting first when I played basketball, some of the various individuals playing basketball against me had some rather quaint nicknames, not which I can repeat. My first job was in a machine shop, and I'm around a lot of people with some pretty coarse language, and I got some nicknames there. Then I worked for PG&E digging ditches, working with ditch diggers, right? And people that are swinging shovels and digging with backhoes, and I got those. Worked later, even when I went to Yale University, I was a janitor in the Yale Bowl. Got some nicknames there. We've all had them, right? And it is amazing to me, but as she points out, this reporter in Atlantic thinks that as soon as they put out a rather humorous meme about J.D. Vance or give him a nickname, that somehow then we all think he's doofus. And I think they have completely misread the world. And I really wonder what world they live in. It's probably not the world that most of you who listen to Point of View live in. And I just thought we'd end with that one. Humor and the cultural divide. Maybe that's why sometimes they don't get those jokes in the Babylon Bee either. But nevertheless, one more illustration of the cultural divide in America. Tomorrow, we're going to have a really good program. We had a great one today with Keisha Russell. If you didn't hear it, you might want to listen to it again. It's all available at the website, pointofview.net. Some of those will make their way into the Point of View highlights on Spotify that Megan does. And Megan, thank you for doing that. Steve, thank you for producing the program. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up, but we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
Thank you, Kerby. I really appreciate your program. You cover a lot of issues that a lot of us think about, I'm sure. And this is the first time I've ever called in, so I appreciate your input, too.
Oh, I thank God for what you're doing on Point of View. You guys have more influence across this country than I believe any of them in terms of tackling the issues and getting the truth out to Americans. It's getting to the point where truth just is bottled up on every hand. Every time you turn around, there's another big bottleneck against truth. I hope your listeners realize what Point of View is doing and supports Point of View in every possible way you can.
You know, I can't go to Washington. I can't do those things, so the only way that I can help is the way that God has provided for me, and to give some of that back to you guys. So, like you said, partnering with Point of View, because, you know, you can't do it alone. Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.